Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's reflection. In this space, we explore the quieter layers of the mind, the unseen shifts in perception, and the moments that slowly change how we understand ourselves and others. What follows is not about events that happen loudly in life, but about realizations that arrive silently and reshape everything from within. There comes a moment in life that doesn't arrive through failure, heartbreak, or even loneliness. It comes quietly, almost unnoticed, when you finally stop waiting. You stop looking for who acknowledged your silence. You stop expecting that someone will finally understand the weight you carry inside your mind. You stop believing that relief will come through another person, lifting what you've been holding alone. And in that stillness, something unsettling begins to unfold. You start seeing people without the filters you once used to protect your hope. One of the most difficult human experiences is facing the shadow within. Yet the shadow is not only made of anger, jealousy, or darker impulses. Sometimes it holds something far more painful, the quiet truth of abandonment, the realization that you were still waiting to be saved. Saved by friends, by love, by family, by recognition, by success, by someone who would finally make everything feel lighter. Many people unknowingly build their personality around this expectation. They become agreeable, hoping kindness will eventually be returned. They become useful, believing usefulness guarantees importance. They become endlessly available, thinking emotional devotion creates safety. But life has a way of revealing the hidden terms behind those unspoken agreements. You support people in their hardest moments, only to see them drift away once they are fine again. You remain loyal during chaos, only to discover that loyalty was not equally shared. You listen to others deeply until the moment you need to speak, and the atmosphere shifts into discomfort. And that silence leaves a mark, because slowly you begin to understand something most people resist for as long as they can. Attention is not the same as love. Need is not the same as loyalty. Closeness is not the same as commitment. Human beings can appear emotionally deep when it benefits them, yet withdraw when depth becomes a responsibility rather than an advantage. What feels disturbing is not that people leave. It is how naturally it happens. The persona is a mask necessary for social life. Everyone wears one: the supportive friend, the loyal partner, the strong one, the understanding one. But pressure exposes what lies beneath the performance. When life becomes difficult or you begin to change, those masks around you begin to slip. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts. Delayed responses, reduced warmth, quiet distance, emotional withdrawal at moments when presence matters most. And this is where understanding begins to fracture illusions. There is a belief many people carry from childhood that effort guarantees permanence, that if you care enough, give enough, and stay patient enough, others will eventually do the same. But reality rarely follows that logic. People do not always reject weakness. More often, they withdraw from the possibility that you might outgrow the version of yourself they were comfortable with, and that alone has ended many connections that once felt unbreakable. Over time, you begin remembering things you once overlooked, the silence that followed your success, the subtle discomfort when you stopped being endlessly available, the shift in energy when you started setting boundaries. Slowly, patterns become impossible to ignore, because kindness without boundaries quietly teaches others where your limits are, even when you never say them out loud. Most people never realize this until exhaustion forces awareness, and as clarity increases, another uncomfortable truth emerges. Human connection is often conditional beneath the surface. People are drawn toward what feels beneficial, what feels emotionally rewarding, what reinforces their sense of comfort or identity. Even empathy can have limits that are rarely admitted. People may appreciate depth, but few are willing to stay immersed in someone else's pain indefinitely. This realization can change the way a person moves through the world. Some stop asking for help, not out of strength, but out of understanding how rarely emotional rescue is as unconditional as they once believed. Independence becomes a form of adaptation, a way of avoiding disappointment rather than a sign of complete healing. Yet beneath that independence often sits a quieter grief, the recognition that no one was truly coming in the way they once imagined, not with permanent emotional presence, not with consistent understanding, not with the kind of rescue they silently hoped for. And when illusions fall away, identity begins to shake, because many people are not fully aware of who they are outside the roles they perform for others. The helper, the achiever, the strong one, the emotionally stable one. When those roles no longer receive reflection from the outside world, something internal begins to destabilize. This is why solitude feels so intense for many. Silence removes the audience. There are no reactions, no validation, no mirrors confirming identity, only awareness. And without distraction, a person is left facing themselves directly. In that space, uncomfortable questions begin to surface. If no one rescues you, why are you still waiting? If people only know your version of survival, who are you beneath it? If love disappears when you change, what was it built on in the first place? Most connections do not collapse when respect is lost. They fade when awareness arrives. And awareness, once gained, cannot be easily undone. You start noticing how often people speak emotionally but act strategically, how affection is sometimes tied to control, and how admiration quietly fades once dependence disappears. Gradually, you begin to see that many social bonds are maintained less by truth and more by mutual psychological comfort. This shift changes how you move through the world. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop chasing understanding from those who were never willing to offer it. You stop forcing emotional reciprocity where it never existed. And something colder forms inside you, not hatred, but distance. Because once you accept that nobody is truly coming to complete your emotional world, another realization follows. Much of your suffering was expectation. Expectation that others would think, feel, sacrifice, and remain as you do. But people often filter relationships through their own psychological needs. Some stay because you make them feel important. Some because you give them safety. Some because you absorb their loneliness. Very few operate without some form of unconscious gain. This is what unsettles most people when they begin to see clearly. Even attachment often increases when you withdraw, because the mind values uncertainty more than availability. What is consistent becomes invisible. What is uncertain becomes desired. And suddenly, relationships begin to look less like emotional truths and more like shifting psychological dynamics. You also start seeing how conversations are rarely pure exchanges. They become subtle negotiations for validation, control, or identity protection. One person speaks to be understood, the other listens to preserve self-image, and truth gets filtered in between. Over time, awareness changes everything. You stop confusing attention with sincerity, charm with character, and presence with permanence. You also begin noticing something harder: your own patterns, the need to be chosen, the fear of abandonment, the ways you sometimes overgive just to avoid emptiness. Because the most uncomfortable part of clarity is not what it reveals about others, but what it exposes within yourself. You begin to see how often you tolerated what hurt you, not because you didn't know better, but because silence felt safer than loss. Awareness strips the emotional glamour from behavior. Suddenly, your past appears less tragic and more predictable. That realization can be deeply unsettling because it suggests that much of what people do is driven less by conscious choice and more by unconscious compensation. People are not only searching for love, they are often searching for relief from themselves. And once this becomes clear, the social world begins to rearrange in your mind. You stop asking who loves you and start asking who needs you to remain a certain version of yourself. That question reveals more than most people are ready to see. Some relationships survive only because you stay predictable. Some friendships exist because you remain smaller than your potential. Some family dynamics stay stable only while you continue playing the role assigned to you long ago. The moment you change, tension appears. Not because growth is wrong, but because it disrupts emotional equilibrium. People often become attached not to you, but to the version of you that fits their internal structure. When you evolve, their comfort is disturbed. The reliable one becomes distant. The people pleaser develops boundaries. The giver stops overextending. And boundaries reveal truth faster than conflict ever does, because restricted access exposes hidden entitlement. At that point, separation becomes clearer. You begin distinguishing real connection from emotional dependency. You stop confusing intensity with depth. Some of the strongest emotional bonds are actually built on unresolved wounds, where one person seeks reassurance and the other seeks control, and the chaos gets mistaken for love. But what remains unconscious eventually takes control. This is why people repeat patterns they consciously want to escape, and why small triggers can produce intense emotional reactions. A delay, a tone shift, a bit of distance. These moments often activate older wounds rather than present reality. Without awareness, projection becomes the default response. People blame circumstances, others, or fate, instead of recognizing the internal patterns shaping their reactions. Confronting this requires accepting a difficult truth. Identity is partly built from adaptation, fear, and unprocessed emotion, not just intention. Even ambition can become compensation. Success is sometimes pursued not for fulfillment, but for worth. Yet, external achievement rarely heals internal emptiness, which is why people can reach their goals and still feel unfulfilled. The goal was never the goal, it was escape. Eventually, it becomes clear that no external force is coming to resolve internal conflict. Not love, not success, not validation. External outcomes may distract the mind, but they rarely heal the deeper structure of suffering. This is why some people sabotage what they once wanted or feel uneasy instability after years of chaos. The mind often returns to what feels familiar, even when it hurts. Healing, in this sense, is not instant happiness. It is increased awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable because it removes illusion and exposes the mechanics behind behavior. Fear begins to appear disguised as personality. Independence masking mistrust, ambition masking emptiness, emotional control masking past hurt. Society often rewards these masks, which makes them harder to let go of. Productivity born from pain is praised. Emotional suppression is called maturity. Self-sacrifice is seen as virtue. Yet reward does not equal healing. It often reinforces fragmentation. This is why solitude feels difficult for many. Without distraction, the mind confronts what was being avoided: loneliness, shame, regret, dependency, fear. Eventually, life forces stillness through loss, exhaustion, or change, and in that stillness, avoidance is no longer possible. In that space, a final realization emerges. The life you were waiting for permission to live has always required your own decision. Stronger boundaries, self-respect, emotional clarity, and responsibility were never going to be given from outside. And when that is understood, another truth follows. If no one is coming to save you, then no one is stopping you either. Most limitations were never external. They were internal patterns repeated long enough to feel like reality. After that, life becomes strangely quiet, not externally, but internally. The constant psychological bargaining begins to fade. You stop negotiating your worth through usefulness, stop seeking reassurance from emotionally inconsistent people, and stop trying to decode mixed signals from those who benefit from your uncertainty, because uncertainty itself starts to reveal a pattern. Emotional inconsistency often holds attention more than consistency ever could, not always through intention, but through effect. The mind becomes attached to what it cannot fully predict, mistaking instability for depth and anxiety for connection. But with awareness, that pattern begins to dissolve. Emotional chaos is no longer romanticized. It is recognized for what it often is, a nervous system pulled toward familiar discomfort. And that shift changes how you relate to others. Not into coldness, but clarity. You stop trying to rescue people who remain committed to their own cycles. You stop valuing potential over behavior. You stop interpreting intensity as transformation, because suffering alone does not guarantee growth. It can deepen understanding, or it can simply repeat itself in new forms. At some point, awareness introduces responsibility, not for everything that happened to you, but for what continues through you. This is where patterns become visible. Those who were hurt may become guarded. Those who were neglected may become dependent on validation, and those who were controlled may begin controlling others. Without interruption, pain reproduces itself quietly through behavior. But once you stop waiting for emotional rescue, something shifts. You become less dependent on external approval. You stop collapsing when misunderstood, stop over-explaining boundaries to people unwilling to respect them, and stop tying your stability to someone else's presence or absence. A different kind of steadiness emerges, one built not on validation, but on survival of internal storms. And with it comes a quiet realization. Much of what you endured internally was never seen by anyone else, yet you carried it alone and continued anyway. That awareness becomes evidence of resilience, not in a loud sense, but in a grounded one. From there, perception changes. Connection is no longer worshipped. It is appreciated without dependency. Love is no longer fused with survival. Care is no longer confused with self-abandonment. Because everything human begins to reveal its temporary nature, attention, roles, feelings, even relationships. At first, this understanding feels heavy, but over time, it becomes freeing. When nothing is guaranteed, performance loses its necessity. You no longer need to earn constant approval or maintain an identity designed to avoid rejection. You can simply exist without negotiating your worth. And as this settles in, rejection stops feeling like collapse. Loneliness stops feeling like proof of inadequacy. Silence stops feeling like punishment. Much of suffering is revealed not as reality itself, but as resistance to reality. The deeper illusion was always that someone or something would eventually arrive to make everything complete. But what becomes clearer is that what is unacknowledged within the self does not disappear. It continues shaping reactions, relationships, fears, and desires from beneath awareness. Ignored pain becomes dependency. Ignored fear becomes control. Ignored insecurity becomes overcompensation. The unconscious always expresses itself in some form, which is why self-awareness becomes unavoidable if change is real. And with that awareness comes a difficult integration, the recognition that a person is never only one thing. Not only wounded, not only responsible, not only victim, not only cause. Human experience is layered, and seeing that complexity removes simple narratives but creates clarity. Eventually, the idea of rescue dissolves completely. Relationships become clearer. Boundaries become simpler. Energy is no longer spent chasing emotional certainty from others, because the focus shifts from being completed externally to becoming conscious internally, seeing clearly, relating honestly, and no longer abandoning yourself to maintain connection. And in that realization, something fundamental changes. Life is no longer a search for someone to arrive and fix what is unresolved inside. It becomes the willingness to face it directly. At that point, loneliness loses its emotional charge. It stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like clarity, a space where illusions fade and perception becomes honest again. And perhaps that is the quiet turning point most people avoid, the moment waiting ends and self-awareness begins. In the end, something quietly settles inside you, not because life becomes easier, but because your expectations stop fighting reality. You no longer wait for situations to resolve you or for people to arrive and complete what feels unfinished within you. There is a strange kind of peace in that acceptance. Not the kind built on comfort, but the kind built on clarity. You begin to see that most of what once felt like loss was also illusion leaving. The illusion that someone would permanently understand you. The illusion that consistency was guaranteed. the illusion that emotional safety would be given rather than created internally. And once those illusions lose their hold, life becomes simpler to navigate. Not perfect, not painless, but honest. You stop building emotional futures around uncertain people. You stop investing your stability into shifting dynamics. You stop abandoning yourself in exchange for temporary connection. What remains is not emptiness, but presence. A quieter relationship with yourself, where silence is no longer threatening and solitude is no longer punishment. It becomes a space where you can finally hear your own thoughts without distortion. You begin to understand that no one was ever meant to carry your entire emotional world. Not because people are incapable of care, but because consciousness was never designed to be outsourced. Every person ultimately meets the same responsibility in a different form, to face their own mind without escape. And so the search changes. Not outward, but inward. Not for rescue, but for clarity. Not for someone to complete the story, but for the awareness to understand it. In that understanding, something soft but irreversible happens. The urgency fades, the chasing stops, the noise inside quiets, and what remains is a simple truth that feels almost ordinary, yet changes everything. You were never waiting for others to arrive. You were waiting to see clearly enough that you no longer needed them to.